how should you orient it, what dimensions should it be, how to actually dig it, and what supplies you'll need for making it, and then also for the demonstrations. And we've got a sidebar that we'll include that's about soil pit safety, which is really important, especially if you're going to have groups of people out there looking at it. Next slide. And then after sort of those logistics, we offer some demonstration discussion points. So these are things that whoever is going to be presenting the soil pit can talk about. So they're things like landscape position and history, management history, the different features you can look at within the soil horizons, biological features to point out, and then we provide examples of connecting all those features and the function with the management and sort of tying it all together. And within each of those discussion points, those topics, there is a goal, like a learning goal that we state, and then discussion points and questions to ask for the educators to use under each of those. Then we just wrap it up with a summary. So that's what we've got for the soil pit guide.
Great. Thank you, Gabby. Any commentary on that? Again, feel free to put things in the chat if something comes to mind. Jonathan, you're up next.
All righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Kilpatrick, work for Sustainable Farming Association. So my contribution to this project was a handbook on what I call the 5 soil health tests that are relatively simple for farmers and producers to execute on their own. But there's still a lot of powerful observations you can make about the health and function of your soil with these tests. So I call it the shovel test, which is really just taking a shovel out, kind of digging up soil and allowing you to interact with the soil in that fashion. Bricks test, so testing the bricks of plants, whether that's in a crop field or pasture. Higher bricks means healthier functioning soil and has some really good ramifications downstream for livestock and for crops. So infiltration test, obviously that's what you see there in the picture, doing a infiltration test in a cornfield. Temperature test, how warm is your soil? How cold is your soil? Can tell you a lot about the conditions for the soil biology. And then the slate test. So again, another test looking at the relationship that soil has with water. So yeah, we go to, I guess, go to the next slide. So each of these in the handbook, it's going to lay it out so that whether you're a producer or an educator, it's going to be easy for you to be able to take the handbook, go out there in the field and do it. So cover both tools and supplies that you needed, some observations that you can make, healthy soil indicators, and then taking what you see and applying it to management practices. Taking it's one thing to do a test, but it's also use that test to influence how you manage your resources. So we've written it so that educators can use it, obviously, for field days, workshops, or you can use it one-on-one with a producer, or a producer could have the handbook and use it themselves as they, look at their resources across their farms and ranches. So, I think next slide, or do you want to stop and take questions about this one, Jane, before I move to the next one?
Yeah, we can take a beat if anybody has anything you want to say about those basic soil health tests.
Jonathan, this is George. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, George.
No, go ahead, George.
Just a question. What do you think aggregate stability? I mean, that can't be maybe done on the farm, but what do you think of that as a useful test?
That's really what the slate test would show you is aggregate stability. In my mind, at least, you really get to see what the relationship with soil and water and the soil and water relationship and that hydraulic pressure of the water on the soil is what's going to show you how stable your aggregates are. So, yeah, that would be where I would go for that.
Thanks.
Yep.
Jonathan, do you want to maybe describe what exactly the slake test looks like? How you do it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess I don't have a picture in here. So a slake test is um I think in the guide I'll have like canning jars because everybody has a canning jar or two laying around. You can buy fancy slake tubes. They're pretty spendy, or actually some nice vases will work as well. So what you basically do is you go out in the field and you harvest what they call peds of soil, so clumps of soil. It's basically bigger chunks. You dry them down. So I just set them on my workbench for a couple of days, let them dry. Some people put them in the oven like at really low temp if you really need or dehydrator. The idea is to get the moisture out, and then you fill the vase or the jar with water, and you have a little piece of hardware cloth, and that holds the clump of soil at the top. But you submerge the whole ped in the water, and what will happen is the hydraulic pressure of the water interacting with that soil clump. If there's good aggregate and pore space in this clump of soil, the water will move in and it won't break apart as much. But if you don't have good aggregate stability or pore space, that hydraulic pressure of the water will start forcing clumps of soil off, and it will slake off and fall to the bottom, and then the water will be pretty cloudy typically with soil that's not functioning well. So yeah, there'll be pictures in the handbook. There'll be a lot more detail on how to do all these tests.
Great. All right. You want to move on to fencing?
Sure. So the second handbook that I'm going to be contributing is on basics of electric fencing. I think we just felt like having a guide for people. I run into this quite frequently, that there's a lot of, fundamental things that we'll see producers still can get wrong with electric fencing. So just having a handbook to help people understand what electric fencing is, what it is not, is also pretty important too. Understand the limits and boundaries of that, and then it's going to just serve as a guide for both conservation professionals and producers. So I'll go through energizer options, proper grounding, fence material selection for different contexts, depending on what you're trying to contain and what you're trying to fence in or out. Some small ruminant options, that's a growing thing. So what works for sheep and goats, and then grazing cover crops and crop residues, I think is something we'll address, as well as what are some low cost options to be able to effectively get livestock integrated into an annual cropping system. So I am also happy. I'd love to hear some feedback from some of you. Coming from my perspective, writing this, fencing and livestock and grazing has been my career and my world, so I can tend to get a little bit head in the sand as far as what's important. But I would love to hear from you all if there's something that should be in this book that you see that I might miss just because of my perspective. So,
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Anybody want to speak to that?
For this one, I would just say we put some basics together as JLBW. I can send you that link. It just might be like, yeah, what am I missing? Or are there some nuances to include? We had put some information together early on. So I'll send that to you.
thank you.
Less a question,
Okay.
Jonathan, and more comment. I'm so glad to see a basic electric fencing document, because even in my role, the number of times I find myself having to explain the basics of grounding and the basics of complete circuits is higher than I would have expected. And so I'm glad to see this. And I also think it's a great pairing with, I know more and more states are starting to have like a grazing demo trailer or a fencing demo trailer. And I think this would just fit in so perfectly with those outreach opportunities. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'm excited to get this done and be able to use it myself, just because for that simple matter, I can hand it to somebody and save myself a lot of time explaining something. So, not that I'm not willing to, but it can help. So, yeah, I think this should be a good one.
All right, great. Moving on to the winter grazing document, and Denise Schwab.
So Shelby Gross, our forage agronomist, and myself and Jason Cavanini are working on this document. It does probably have a very heavy beef cow focus, so may need to reach out to Margaret and a few others to get more of that small ruminant focus into it. But we start off with just some general information related to what are the winter requirements of beef cattle, to make sure that whatever forage we're providing in that dormant season is meeting those requirements, and a little bit just in terms of grazing management. And then really looking at what we view as probably the 5 major options for winter grazing. So first being crop residue grazing, and being the upper Midwest, very heavy focused on corn stalk grazing. The next being stockpiling perennial forages. So really thinking in terms of pastures and tall fescue in that section. The next section focused on annual forages and cover crops. So how might we stockpile through the growing season, particularly thinking about warm season annuals, but to be able to graze those then into wintertime. The 4th section would be on swath grazing, so more of a methodology, and looking at harvesting, or at least mowing and windrowing some of those taller forages to be able to graze through the winter. And then last being bale grazing. Trying to pull in some research that's been proven across the upper Midwest into each of those sections, and looking at benefits and challenges with each. Any questions? All right.
Great. Thanks, Denise. Solar grazing, Margaret or Sabrina, who wants to grab it?
I think we're going to tag team. So we have solar grazing or grazing under solar panels, and our document approach was to give a brief overview and sort of help make decisions about whether this is a good fit for you or not, whether educator helping a producer themselves. But so our overall goals were, as I said, to describe solar grazing and what that looks like, and then provide some considerations to decide if it's good fit, which we'll show more in the next slide. And then if you do decide that this is a good fit for you, or the person you're working with, provide some extra context regarding grazing planning, and then other considerations for the solar site itself and the contracting process. Next slide. So the basically headings on our fact sheet, what is agrivoltaics and solar grazing, and then who are the parties involved. So the different entities, from the solar developer to the landowner to the utility company, and how those you might interact with them as a solar grazer. Then determining, like I said, if it's a good fit for you, what things do we need to consider, like having alternative housing through the winter, and the portable nature of this grazing. Do you have infrastructure at each site? Are you able to move and be at the sites at a timely schedule when the site owner needs you, or the O&M company needs you? And then grazing plan considerations. So what do these sites look like? What sort of forage is there? And what does that mean for a grazing plan, as well as for handling livestock? And then we do touch on some components and requirements of the contract. It's not exhaustive, but the main points that for sure should be included when creating a vegetation management contract with our O&M companies at solar sites. And then we link to some solar grazing resources as well. Next slide.
And I'll take this one. After the first round of we wrote our first draft, and after the first round of reviews, we added and adjusted a couple of components. So we elaborate a little bit further on any known safety risks to livestock. They are relatively few, but we wanted to make sure that it was clearly stated what those could be. Really emphasize that one of the challenges of writing a fact sheet about something like this is that the vegetation at every site may be different, and it will change over time from when the site is first set up and starting to establish versus maybe 3 to 5 years down the line. So we talk about how that will impact how the grazer approaches it, how the management or livestock selection may change. That tied in with below, let's spell out very clearly how to think about putting the right type of animals on the site, on whatever site you have, to deal with that variable vegetation. A little bit more emphasis on the requirement of liability insurance. Unfortunately, there's no way for us to put a dollar value on that because it is so variable by state, by location, by company, but at least noting that that is a consideration and a potential concern. There were the design of the site, the panel layout was mentioned as something we should elaborate on further. We did that a little bit. Noting that in addition to animal safety, that most people working in a site like this will have to have their own personal protective equipment and abide by those sorts of safety considerations. So it's very different than just renting a pasture from someone and putting animals on it. And then while the vast majority of sites are sheep under panels, cattle are an option, and so we've made the language less species specific whenever it makes sense, because cattle grazing is likely to become a more attractive option in certain parts of the Midwest. That's our last slide on the solar grazing, so any questions or comments there? If not, we can move on, and I think I'm still next.
All right.
So another fact sheet, and this one I led along with Megan, providing a lot of really valuable information. So my main role is working with Practical Farmers of Iowa, but on the side, I do targeted grazing with goats on the go, and I also do recruitment and onboarding of new folks. So this is a significant part of my job, talking to folks who are interested in using mostly small ruminants for invasive species management. Now, my work is traditionally with the farmers who might be doing this, but a lot of things like the main considerations, the main questions they have, very relevant as an education sort of thing. So the gist of this fact sheet is we're trying to convey that invasive species management is a really unique land access opportunity and an income source for those who can port their animals around all over the place. But it's simple, but it's not easy. Folks need to be able to identify plants and make grazing plans on the fly and adjust very quickly and have a lot of infrastructure ready to go. The fact sheet itself is definitely not a how-to document. We're not talking about how to set up these variable sites or how to identify these plants, but mostly just listing, here's the things that a potential grazer needs to think about, needs the skills they need to gain. And then here's possible options to get those skills or information. Next slide, please, Jane. So the components of this fact sheet, introducing the concept of targeted grazing, a little bit about the industry, and then listing the factors that people need to understand before they take on this work. And the ones I really identified components of grazing management and grazing plans. When are you grazing? How often are you grazing? How hard are you grazing? How often are you coming back to that site? Basically land management or forage management concerns, because in this context, it differs greatly from managing a permanent or perennial pasture. We talk about animal selection, so the species and then the classes within those species, similar to solar grazing, just because these sites can vary so much. We talk about when it may be appropriate to use dry weather or wethers or dry does or ewes as opposed to lactating females with their kids outside. We talk about some of the necessary knowledge or experience. So again, being able to guesstimate grazing rate of your animals, identifying specific forage species and knowing whether they are toxic, palatable, things like that. And then we talk about the necessary tools and infrastructure. So the components of fencing, watering, and shelter, and considerations for deploying different types of fencing, watering, and shelter depending on the site. Next slide, please. Similarly, addressing some concerns and notes from the reviewers after round one. Shade and shelter is a question that many customers ask, and we as practitioners sometimes have to provide. So we talked about potential risks and concerns of using trailers. That's often a small ruminant shelter option. There were some requests that we go into depth on how to control very specific forage species, and it's a bit more how-to than we can really fit in this document, but we did elaborate a bit more on like where to go find that sort of species, vegetation species specific information. Similarly, elaborated a bit more on incorporating targeted grazing into the long-term land management. So working with a landowner to identify their long-term goals and figure out where grazing fits. Again, we're trying not to be prescriptive and say that this is when you should use grazing as opposed to not, but just noting that it is one of a number of tools that are available, and practitioners should be aware of other tools and when they might be appropriate. More detail on the appropriate livestock classes or species, and then comments on public perception. In my role, I deal with a lot of public perception issues, either because the customers are worried about coyotes or whatever, or because even though I know the goats have a pond, people will get upset if they don't see visible water. So we toned down some of the public perception issues and kept it to animal management concerns. You know, there needs to be water available, fresh water, less about whether or not it looks good to the general public. But did leave a signage section and some wording about safety concerns for the livestock, because human and dog threat is so very large in this line of work. And so I don't feel fair encouraging anybody to do this without mentioning that specifically. That's my last slide for this one. Megan, do you have any comments? And then if anyone has questions or comments in general.
Margaret, I do think that your last point there on addressing the threats from humans and dogs is also very critical. So thank you for adding that, and just thank you for the work you've done on it.
Any other comments people want to bring up? As you can see, our folks working on these are very knowledgeable, very thoughtful. These are going to be some awesome resources once they're completed, and we're looking at probably late spring of next year, 2026, to have these ready to roll. Okay, virtual fence technical document, Stephanie and Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So first, I want to explain that this technical document has a little bit of a different time frame than the fact sheets we just covered. Our first draft is due by the end of this year, and then the final technical document is due in the last year of this grant. So I believe it's in 2027. And so we just have a very rough draft started, and the goal for this fact sheet or this technical document is to hit on some angles that haven't really been talked about widely in the virtual fencing space yet. And what we've identified for those angles are around helping grazing planners, NRCS employees, and potentially TSPs and or producers who are very serious about adopting this technology in writing a grazing plan that includes virtual fence and the technical pieces that go with that. And so one of those components is going to be a virtual fence readiness worksheet, which is essentially a worksheet activity that folks can fill out that helps them see their readiness to adopt this type of technology. It's taken from a tech adoption worksheet that the University of Wisconsin has already published. We also want to explore how best to navigate the NRCS equip cost share if you are interested in doing so as a producer. How you work with your NRCS representative to do so. We want to share some producer experiences who have successfully got equip from NRC or cost share from NRCS for virtual fencing, which there are very few of those people that exist already. And, just probably a couple of them in the upper Midwest. But 2025 was the first year for virtual fence cost share. There will be more folks that adopt it in 2026 and 2027. So we'll have a bit more experience to pull from. We do have plans to create a virtual fence partial budgeting tool. We'll share different examples within that for those partial budgets. One will be an example using cost share versus no cost share. And then we do plan to add lessons from cost benefit interviews with different producers who have adopted virtual fencing. And I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie Bowers to speak about those interviews.
Yes, thanks, Megan. Yeah, part of the work involved is just having organized interviews with producers who have chosen to use virtual fencing, trying to get at we've spent the past couple years learning that virtual fencing does indeed work, but then there's the $1,000,000 question of, is it economically justifiable? And, the famous extension answer is, it depends. So my goal is to be able to interview producers to try to get at, well, in your situation, how has it been beneficial? How can we assign a dollar value to that to help inform other producers? Because virtual fencing may not be right for every single equip contract, but it might be right for a certain percentage. So just essentially developing that awareness and that mindset of what are lessons learned from people that are using virtual fence now. And also especially pulling on those unexpected benefits, like how is this technology really impacting your operation? So super excited about that. So thanks.
And I'll add that since we are in such a rough draft stage of this document, we are very much open for feedback or, would love to hear from others on, specific angles that we could take that don't exist already out there around virtual fencing technical information.
Great. Thanks, Megan and Stephanie. I think we need to make sure you get well acquainted with Dean Current and Dennis Mugambi.
Thank you.
Sooner rather than later. So I'll have them introduce themselves at the end here. Great. So Laura Payne and Jason Cavadini have been working on the cover crops fact sheet, and Jason, I believe, is out at a field day or something, not able to attend, and Laura was on, but let me know she was having internet trouble and had to drop off. And so I think I'll just see if I can quickly get to the fact sheet that they've been working on, which is cover crop grazing. And sorry, see if I can get to that quick. Actually, while I'm doing that, Dean and Dennis, why don't you take advantage of the downtime to introduce yourselves? That'd be great to hear from you.
Sure, great. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, a pleasure to be here and be part of this project. After listening to the presentations, it's pretty obvious that we'll need to talk to all of you about the economics because you're working on the different activities. that we'll be looking at with the economic piece. So look forward to that, the interactions. And I just want to mention quickly something that we have that might be of interest, maybe not part of this project, but we have an app called Farm Apps, and it's a farmer to farmer tool that allows people with experience with different types of activities to present their case and then share that with other farmers and potentially then connect to those farmers to learn about their experience, kind of a farmer to farmer, one-to-one type conversation. But yeah, again, looking forward to working with all of you. Dennis?
Yep, thanks so much, Dan. My name is Dennis, working closely with Dan on the economics part of the project. And yeah, looking forward to working with the rest of the folks in developing this integrated fact sheet. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dean. And yeah, we'll start getting you looped in on the project team meetings so that you can get connected with everybody that is working on this. That'll be great. Okay, I did get the cover crop fact sheet up, and so this is something that Laura Payne and Jason Cavadini with Wisconsin Extension have been working on. They originally did it as a University of Wisconsin Extension publication and are just going to do some adapting of it for this project. So grazing cover crops and annual forages.
I'm back on, Jane, if you want me to go through.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Laura, if you want to talk through it, that's great. Just tell me when to scroll down.
Okay. Actually, can I just share my screen? I've got a couple.
Okay, good. Okay. There you go.
Sorry about that. My internet is not behaving today. Oh, sharing is not turned on, it says.
Oh, okay. I just made you a co-host. Now you can.
Okay. Is everybody seeing my screen?
It's coming. There we go.
Okay, so as Jane was saying, thank you, Jane, for introducing that. This is a fact sheet that Jason Cavadini, the University of Wisconsin Extension Grazing Specialist, and I have been working on, just finished it this summer, and we're hoping to adapt this for a wider use. It's somewhat Wisconsin-centric now, but it's got a lot of good information. It's a little more than a fact sheet. It's about 14 pages long. You can see the table of contents. We talk about building a forage chain, some basics about cover crops. Then we've got the cover crop and annual forage species categorized into groupings like cereal grains versus annual broadleafs, things like that. Some discussion about grazing cover crops and annual forages, and then how to use these forages in a perennial grazing system. And then we've got a lot of data just on seeding rates and that sort of thing. So the idea here is that we would kind of flesh out annual options for times of year when our perennial cool season pastures aren't the most productive. So that could include the summer slump season. Denise talked about stockpiling perennial pastures, but we do have some cool season options that can bring us farther into the fall in terms of cool season annuals and start us a little earlier in the spring. And then we've got the kind of more traditional cover crop grazing options to continue fleshing out that forage chain. These are just some benefits for both crop farmers and livestock farmers, thinking in terms of really making this publication appeal to, something that either a livestock farmer or a crop farmer could pick up, and promoting kind of the options for partnerships between crop farmers and livestock farmers to get livestock back on some of that cropland. So this is one of the illustrations in the fact sheet. Across the first line here, we have different scenarios for seeding cover crops into annual cropland. So we've got some interseeding options. We've got some planting after various crops. Then it goes into like when you would plant the cover crop for each of these options, what types of what functional groups or what categories of cover crops would be a good fit for each of these scenarios, and then some examples of mixes, and then when those cover crops would be available to graze. And then to kind of break it down even further, we've got a whole section that just has these little calendars and different scenarios. So like when we want to plant in spring or summer, these are the months when you'd plant, and then these are the months when the crop would be available to graze, and then some suggested mixes. So the fact sheet kind of goes from very general concepts to kind of more detailed. How would you actually do this on your farm? Then the last page of it is actually a large spreadsheet table that has seeding rates, planted alone and in mixtures, time of year to plant, and which species are compatible with each other to promote different mixtures. So that's what that fact sheet is about. And we're, like I said, we're in the process of working with George Booty. He's helping Jason and I on this to adapt it to a more regional audience. So if anybody has any questions or suggestions on that, happy to answer.
Great. Thanks, Laura. That, I believe, is the end of our presentations. And so now it's just open up for discussion. If anybody has questions you want to bring up or comments, now's a great time. We can have a little discussion for a few minutes, and then maybe give you a few minutes back in your day. But thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jane.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Watch for these to be coming out. We'll be sponsoring some events, workshops, conference sessions, and so forth over the next 2 years. And as these become available, we will be pushing them out there for all to use. So will the resources all be available in one spot in the future? Yes. We'll house them all on the Greenlands Blue Waters website, and they'll probably show up in multiple other places as well, but we will have the complete collection. Yep. And then a comment in the Q&A. No questions, but these look fantastic. Thank you. All right.